पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तरदिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet. Sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu. Sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Last week we saw very briefly the question about whether the traits are inherited through heredity or in some other way. And Swami Vivekananda says that there's a lot of argument which we discussed, that one of the reasons the argument for heredity is promoted is because we actually see that there are clearly similarities. Sometimes even when family members and friends visit, there is a birth in the family, even it's a tiny little baby, and I'm not very sure it's even easy to find any similarity at that point, but there'll be people I've seen in India, I don't know how common it is, how universal it is, say, oh, this baby has the nose just like the dad, or the eyes just like a mom. I'm not very sure whether that such a tiny baby, it's easy to make that out. But then as we grow up, we are able to see some physical traits are inherited from parents. The question is, are even our mental traits inherited from parents? And sometimes we might find kind of some of the characteristics, not just physical, but also psychological, might fit some kind of a family pattern. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it might. And these are the kind of things that make people think that a lot of these things are genetically inherited. The other way of thinking, which Swamiji points out, is see on page 14, the paragraph that we finished reading, but I'll just read the last few pages of that, 2 lines of that. And a soul with a certain tendency would, by the laws of affinity, take birth in a body which is the fittest instrument for the display of that tendency. So what Swamiji is really saying is, the other way to look at some of these common characteristics we might find in family members is not necessarily that they were all inherited from parents, but the soul which was supposed to take birth found the best environment where its already pre-existing tendencies would flourish. I mean, that is one of the questions that gets discussed in Vedanta books is, who decides, if we believe in rebirth, who decides where we will be born? Who will be our parents? And sometimes the books say, well, we choose our environment, we choose where we are going to be. Now that way of saying is, none of us ever remembers, anybody asked us, where do you want to be born? But what is meant is that again, I think it will be easier if I very quickly summarize how this whole karma thing functions. It's a big theory, very well developed theory, but let me mention it very briefly. It is this, that every action that we do creates 2 effects in us. An action is both physical action And thinking is a mental activity. So any kind of an activity, physical or mental, produces two effects. One is it's called the result of the action. That's Sanskrit is called karma phala. Karma and karma phala, the fruit of action. And the second is an impression it makes on the mind. For simple example would be, let's say if I've never drunk coffee, and the first time I drink coffee, then that's an activity. I go and drink coffee. Now that's an action, karma. And let us assume that it's a happy experience. I enjoy that coffee. So that activity of drinking coffee produced a result, joy, happiness. But it also produced one more result. And that result is the impression it left on my mind, a samskara, a coffee impression. Now what that impression does, the function of that impression, it remains in the unconscious part of our mind. The only function of that impression is either a memory of this drinking of the coffee or some external stimulus. I pass by Starbucks and I suddenly remember coffee. So any kind of that stimulus activates that impression in the mind, and activating of that impression produces a desire. Desire is called a vasana. So a desire for coffee, if it springs in my heart, it means that it has come from some pre-existing impression there. Now just because the desire comes into the heart doesn't mean I have to act upon it. A lot of times desires come and we feel now this is not the right time for it, maybe I'll do it later. And then the desire again goes back and subsides. But sometimes I might say a desire comes for coffee and I go and drink a second cup. Now, I think I probably will become happy again. So that's the one result. And the second result is one more impression is created. So if I had one impression before, now I had two samskaras. So these are the two kinds of effects that occur. Now, throughout our lives, we are doing lots and lots of actions. And that's what generates joy and sorrow in our life. If it's successful, if it's a happy outcome, it makes us happy. If it's the opposite, we feel sad. And some of the actions don't create either. They're kind of neutral actions. But each of those actions is also producing a samskara. So now what happens? Once the person dies, okay, before we go there, every time we experience joy and sorrow, we are exhausting a little bit of our karma. So all experience is exhausting the karma. All actions are generating karma. So it's like income and expenditure. So every action produces karma. Every experience exhausts the karma. Now, we always do a lot more action than we are able to experience the result of. In other words, our income always exceeds our expenditure. Which means there's always going to be a lot of balance. Now, if you're thinking about dollars, that's a great thing. If your expenditure is less than your income, then of course you're going to collect a lot. So we are now collected a lot of karma balance. So when a person dies with a lot of karma balance. Now, sometimes these karmas are compared to seeds. We know that we want to do gardening and then we go and buy some seeds. Now, oftentimes not every seed can be straight away planted. So sometimes the seed has a germination period that only after a certain time that seed will be ready to bear or a plant for it to come out of that seed. And so when these seeds will be ready for planting, because the seeds are of different kinds, the time for planting also will be different. And so these karma seeds are sometimes compared to those kind of seeds. So we have this big fund of karma, and after a person dies, and death really simply means this external cover of the body going away. And so it is going to be replaced by another cover. Now, what kind of cover will this person whose body is now cremated or buried here, what kind of cover this person will get? So the karma theory says that this huge balance of karma that I have, just by a natural process, the seeds, these karma seeds, which are ready to for planting, ready to yield result, ready for fruition, they come up on the surface. So I've got a huge balance, but these few seeds come up and say, we are ready now to give our... So this is like the, we call it an opening balance. So when a baby is born with these few karma seeds which are ready to bear fruit. Now, no one really knows from my karma balance how many seeds are going to come up which are ready to bear fruit, and what kind of seeds. How much of pain-bearing seeds, how much of joy-bearing seeds. We don't know. They are just a kind of a random collection of seeds ready to bear fruit. Now, those karma then, when a baby is born, the baby is born with those karma. So these karma which have become ready to bear fruit, in Sanskrit they are called prarabdha. Arabdha means beginning. Prarabdha, beginning in a special way, beginning to bear fruit. And the lifespan of a person is often equated with this fruit-bearing karma that we are born with. We might have many different apparent reasons for the termination of life, but we know that not everyone's lifespan is same. Some people die young, some people die when they are very old, some people have a lot of joy, some people have a lot of sorrow, some people have a weird mixture of the two. All of these distinctions are determined by what kind of karma is now ready to bear fruit. And we might also see there are cases when some medical cases, the doctors have said, oh no, there is no hope of survival. Maybe at the most a week or 10 days. And then the person lives for months and months and months after that. And everyone is surprised. And the doctors say, we don't know. And then we attribute, well, we say it's God's grace, or God wants you to live, and so on. And then we also see sometimes people in apparently very good health suddenly go. Or we might sometimes see, we read about it, say a plane crash. When everyone dies, and just one person survives. And then we say, well, how does it happen? And we could say, well, that was just a lucky person. But from the karma standpoint, it simply means the person who survived, that person's that karma was not fully exhausted yet. And once that karma is exhausted, then any excuse will do in order to die. Now, why do I mention all this? I mention all this to show that when a jiva is about to take birth with these fruit-bearing karmas, that mind of that jiva has these impressions of all the actions done in an earlier life. And the law of nature is to find the path of least resistance. That is, to find the most... It's a little bit like... I don't know whether this is an appropriate analogy. It's like a job placement. It's like people see what your talents are, what your qualities are, what qualifications you have, and then say, this particular job or in this particular area, that would be the right fit for you. And then people go there. So this is a little bit like that. So depending on the kind of karmas and the kind of impressions, nature then says, okay, so this particular family or this specific environment would be the best fit to experience the kind of karma you have and to be able to express yourself through the impressions, the samskaras that you have. And so, if in some soul the samskaras are such and the karmas are such that they are more easily experienced through a dog's body rather than a human body, then nature will say, with this set of karmas, you are better off in a dog's body than a human body. So then it's in that sense that we choose our body or choose our environment. So it's really a nature's function that it occurs. And sometimes when we see people behaving like animals or in a very beastly manner, and sometimes we might wonder, maybe nature probably sometimes gets it wrong. They should have been in some animal body and just by some error they are in a human body. Or sometimes we might see some animals akin to some of the traits which we human beings may be able to identify with. Now, I don't know, this is just a theory. I'm just speculating. But these are the different ways the human mind might think about how the diversity exists and how these things occur. It's not expected that everyone has to accept this as some absolute truth. This is just one way of thinking. And if this way of thinking doesn't appeal to us, we are free to explore other possible explanations about why there is the kind of diversity we find in this life. And that's what Swamiji is discussing here. So now let's continue the read on page 14, the para at the bottom. There is another suggestion. Taking all these for granted, how is it that I do not remember anything of my past life? This can be easily explained. I am now speaking English. It is not my mother tongue. In fact, no words of my mother tongue are now present in my consciousness. But let me try to bring them up, and they rush in. That shows that consciousness is only the surface of the mental ocean, and within its depths are stored up all our experiences. Try and struggle, they would come up, and you would be conscious even of your past life. This is direct and demonstrative evidence. Verification is the perfect proof of a theory, and here is the challenge thrown to the world by the rishis. We have discovered the secret by which the very depths of the ocean of memory can be stirred up. Try it, and you would get a complete reminiscence of your past life. So several things here. One of the critiques or the objections to the theory of rebirth is that if I had many past births, how come I don't remember any of them? And that's the kind of objection Swamiji is addressing here. And what he is pointing out is that just because I don't remember something is no proof that that thing didn't exist. It's like, I don't remember what breakfast I had a month ago. That doesn't mean I didn't have breakfast. So I don't remember what I did when I was 1 year old. That doesn't mean I was never 1 year old. So essentially, it demonstrates more limitations in our memory than in the non-existence of that thing that I don't remember. And then there are people who are able to remember. There are some people who are able to remember maybe a little bit faint memory about what they did when they were 2 years old or 3 years old. And maybe we can just think about our own childhood. How far back can we go back in our own life, this life? And what is our first memory? How old were we? And we know that sometimes if we might not remember something, but if we struggle, we say, oh, what exactly? When I was 6 months ago, I was in that place. What happened? And then you keep on thinking and you kind of try to reach there. And that's what he speaks about consciousness struggling. And you might then be able to extract that thing which has kind of gone into the unconscious part of the mind. So there are these two things. One is the thing I mentioned to you before, how these samskaras, impressions, are in the unconscious part of the mind, and something outside can stimulate them, and it comes up as a desire in the heart. So when I feel a desire for something, that desire has already traveled quite a lot. It started from the basement of my mind, so to speak, the unconscious part of my mind, and it comes up, and I become aware of my own desire only when it enters into the conscious part of the mind. And to put it in context, most of us are probably conscious of only 5% of our mind. So the basement is much larger than the living room. So oftentimes it becomes difficult to control our desires. It's because by the time we become conscious of the desire, it has already traveled considerable distance and become strong. And what the yogis can do, what we can do if we try hard enough, that instead of allowing the desire to come up to the surface, by which time it becomes difficult to control it, if I can dive deep inside my own basement and kind of squelch it when it is still very weak. And that's what yogis try to do. So that's one thing. Things from my unconscious coming up to the surface by some external stimulus. The other way is, instead of waiting for it to come up, I try to dive deep inside. And we do that, although we may not visualize it in this manner. Sometimes when we are trying to remember something that we know, but we have forgotten, and then we say, what is it? What is it? And then suddenly we get it. That's essentially what we are doing. We're trying to dive deep inside because those memory of that thing is in my unconscious. Now what Swamiji is saying is, if we train our mind properly, we may be able to go in our unconscious part of the mind at will. And then all these memories, all our past lives, impressions and memories are not kept in some bank somewhere. They're right there, right here, right now. All of our past memories of all past births are right here present in the heart at this moment. And if we can find a way, that's what he says. Try it and you would get a complete reminiscence of your past life. So it's possible. In Patanjali Yoga Sutras, there are aphorisms to show how that thing can be achieved. So it's not a theoretical concept. People have done it and it's possible. Just because it is possible, is it advisable? That's a whole different thing. And I would think don't try it, not worth it. Because life is complicated enough right now. With the impressions of this life itself, life is quite complicated. Now to go and get memory of my past life, why complicate it more? I mean, just think about it this way. If you are able to get memory of your past life, and you go on the street and a total stranger comes in front of you, and you suddenly remember, oh, this is the person, this did some bad thing to me in my last life. It's just going to complicate all relationships. Then people will go insane. So I think it's really a nature's gift that we don't remember our past lives. In fact, I think it's a nature's gift that we don't remember everything even of this life. And I don't know what that medical condition is called, but it is now treated as an illness, this very powerful memory. And And one case that is often cited, it's a woman in somewhere in Maryland, I think, um, who has got this amazing memory. I mean, you can ask her, 23 years ago, on March 23rd, what did you have for breakfast? And she can tell you exactly what she had. And now she's under medical treatment for that because it's unbearable. And so it's a blessing that we forget a lot of things. It's not that great. I think what's helpful is if we remember the things which are helpful, which we need to remember. And there are a lot of things, what I had for breakfast 30 years ago, it's just useless piece of data. It doesn't help. And so if we can focus on things that I don't want to forget that are important and remember that is enough. Swami Sarvagatananda ji, my predecessor here, he used to often say that the secret of happiness is good health and bad memory. So let's read the next part. So then, the Hindu believes that he is a spirit. Him the sword cannot pierce, him the fire cannot burn, him the water cannot melt, him the air cannot dry. This is the paraphrase of the words from the Gita, in the 2nd chapter. The Hindu believes that every soul is a circle whose circumference is nowhere, but whose center is located in the body, and that death means the change of this center from body to body. Nor is the soul bound by the conditions of matter. In its very essence, it is free, unbounded, holy, pure, and perfect. But somehow or other, it finds itself tied down to matter and thinks of itself as matter. Why should the free, perfect, and pure being be thus under the thraldom of matter is the next question. How can the perfect soul be deluded into the belief that it is imperfect? We have been told that the Hindus shirk the question and say that no such question can be there. Some thinkers want to answer it by positing one or more quasi-perfect beings and use big scientific names to fill up the gap. But naming is not explaining. The question remains the same. How can the perfect become the quasi-perfect? How can the pure, the absolute, change even a microscopic particle of its nature? So, Swamiji is here presenting a question that, as the Hindus say, that in reality, we are all pure and perfect beings. We are all free right now. And then the question is, first of all, we don't feel free, we don't feel perfect, we don't feel immortal. And if that is who we really are, then how did we become like this? How did the perfect become imperfect? How did the immortal become mortal? And he says, we have been told that the Hindus shirk the question and say that no such question can be there. Now, we really don't know who have been saying this. It's possible that during Swami Vivekananda's time, that was one of the critiques, that there was a lot of missionary activity in India in those days. It's possible that some of the rebuttals of the Hindu tradition by the missionaries may have included this objection that, well, this is what you say, pure and perfect, and you have no answer to why that pure and perfect became impure and imperfect. So he's just mentioning the kind of critiques that were held 100 years ago. And then he continues, but the Hindu is sincere. He does not want to take shelter under sophistry. He is brave enough to face the question in a manly fashion. And his answer is, I do not know. I do not know how the perfect being, the soul, came to think of itself as imperfect, as joined to and conditioned by matter. But the fact is a fact for all that. It is a fact in everybody's consciousness that one thinks of oneself as the body. The Hindu does not attempt to explain why one thinks one is the body. The answer is that it is the will of God is no explanation. This is nothing more than what the Hindus say, I do not know. Here's another small kind of a counter critique that Swamiji offers, is that the tendency to it's also kind of an easy way out. If there is some question that is asked in matters of religion and we don't have any answer, then an easy way to say, well, that's the will of God. And of course, then all discussion stops. I mean, that's the God's will, then there's nothing you can do about it. But what Swamiji is pointing out is, saying that this is God's will is not that different from saying I do not know. Because, well, God didn't come and tell me that it was God's will. I am still attributing something to it. So, the question is difficult. It's not that it is an easy question. And expressed in different ways, this is a question many religions have to grapple with. And oftentimes the way it gets done is through resorting to myths. Now, myth doesn't necessarily mean that, it's just a made-up story. What the myths do is oftentimes present a truth that cannot be expressed in logical ways. For instance, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we could say God created the human being, and God loves the human being and provided everything, as we have the myth of the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, suddenly, we don't feel that much loved anymore. So how come this beautiful creation of God now finds itself alienated from God? And that's why we have the story of the forbidden fruit and the act of disobedience and how they were cast out of paradise. Now that's a way of understanding the difference between what we see of the ideal state we were in and our present state, and then effort to explain how that fall occurred, if you like. And different traditions might have different ways of expressing that. But one thing every tradition shares in common, that there is some kind of an ideal state which is accepted. It's also accepted that our present state is far from ideal. There is some explanation given about how that fall from that ideal state occurred. And depending on how that narrative is formed, depending on how the problem is stated, the solution becomes apparent. So if the problem, as we experience it now, is expressed in terms of, let's say, an act of disobedience to God, if that's the primary reason why the fall occurred, then clearly the obvious solution would be that my life should be led in obedience to the God's laws. So how the narrative occurs proves how the solution will be. And what Swami Vivekananda is pointing out here is, when he says, the Hindus say, I do not know. Now, to say I do not know, one way of expressing, the normal and natural way to express it, well, I do not know. But if you try to now figure out what I do not know means, it means I'm ignorant of it. And then, as we will see going forward, how ignorance, therefore, becomes the starting point. What the Hindus' philosophy will then, the philosophical structure is how the perfect became imperfect, how the free became bound, how the immortal became mortal, is because of ignorance. And that ignorance is our present experience, because if someone asks us, how did all this happen? And the honest answer is, I really don't know. I mean, the most we can do is refer to some books or refer to some theory, but as far as the experience is concerned, I do not know. And then Swamiji will develop this idea further of what it means, what does the implication of I do not know is. And that we will take up next week. If you have any comments, questions, thoughts about, especially about the topics that we discussed today, feel free to share. Yeah. Johnny?
Hi, it's just a comment on this last topic, and it's probably like without ignorance, without identifying with our body, like human and animal, there wouldn't be life. Because like, why would you do anything if you know that you are God? Because you are God, you are not a human. So like, or an animal. So like, in order for life to perpetuate and to eat and to reproduce and to give a meaning to what doesn't, that's why, there is this ignorance. Yep. Because otherwise it couldn't be anything else.
That's true. I mean, you're right. The need to do something shows the sense of incompleteness. Because why would I want to do anything at all? And always, whatever activity we are engaged in has some need is being fulfilled by that activity. Why do I eat? Well, because I'm hungry. If I don't eat, I'll die. Why do I breathe? Why do I go to a baseball game? Well, it makes me happy. So everything, it's a little bit like when I have had a heavy meal, I'm no more hungry. I don't feel like eating because that need is not there anymore. Now, if I'm the infinite, I'm the divine, I don't have any need. And so why do I need to do anything at all? In fact, the question that gets asked often is, why did God create the world? What need did God have to create the world? And the answer is, I do not know. And then further on, what it would mean is, that maybe God didn't really create the world. Maybe in my ignorance, I'm imagining that He created the world. But that's a preview of what is to come. But right now, I do not know. It's ignorance. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. So it seems to me that we don't have direct access to our samskaras or impressions until they bubble up into the conscious mind. So if there's a negative impression that
we have access, but we need to be trained for it. I mean, it's not nobody has stopped us from accessing it. Just that if we try, we have. I mean, they're right here, right now. So you could say that the access is difficult, but you cannot say that there is no access. Yeah.
So just to clarify, so you mean that people who haven't been trained don't have access to the unconscious, and that's why they have to rely on it to bubble up and then come up as desire to either act or not act?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a little bit like I can go into my basement anytime I want, but if I'm too lazy, I won't do it. And then I just have to wait. There's some rotting smell coming from somewhere. And then I say, there's something rotting in my basement. And then you'll go and take care of it. But otherwise, Even before that, if I just go and find, oh, this needs to be taken care of, otherwise it's going to rot after a few days. It's a little bit, it's not a good analogy, but that's how it is. Yeah. Yes.
Namaskaram, Swamiji. So I have a question. So ignorance is infinite, right? You can always be ignorant about something, like always throughout your life. So if that can be forever, you can be ignorant, then how do you ever become complete? So your knowledge is limited, but ignorance is unlimited. So
Yes.
how does something come to a closed state, a complete state, if ignorance can always be there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what the sages found is that because there is so much that we don't know, if I make an effort to know everything one after another, there's never going to be enough time to know it. And so what they said is, can I know, is there some way that if I know one thing, I will know everything? You see, it's a little bit like when people cook rice, for instance. Have you cooked rice? And so sometimes, because nowadays there's a lot of gadgets available, you can just kind of put water and just forget about it, and the rice is ready. It switches off by itself, and it's pretty easy now. But think about in earlier days, but not too long ago, really. Just maybe I can think of my own childhood. So, how do you know when the rice is just ready? And one way would be to kind of just pick up a grain or two and just kind of just hold it in your hand and see whether it is soft enough, the right, the right texture? Yeah, for eating. Now, you're not going to take every grain and test it. If you just take one or two and you say, okay, now it's ready, it's done. So can something like that be done in life? Because there are billions of things, and as you say, there's always going to be some ignorance or the other. But is it possible to know one thing by which everything will be known? In fact, that is a question asked in one of the Upanishads called the Mundaka Upanishad. It begins, in fact, with this question. A disciple asks his teacher, Kasminnu bhagavan bhagavo vidnyate sarvamidam vidnyatam bhavati. What is it knowing which everything will be known? It's a little bit like nowadays when you have to create so many online accounts. People ask you to sign up everywhere, and you need a username and you need a password, and then they tell you not to use the same password everywhere because that's a security risk. And so, but human beings are smart. So now we have password managers, right? Like how many of you use 1Password, by the way? Any other password managers you use? How do you track your passwords? Or maybe just in a notebook, manually writing. I mean, that's of course one way. But anyway, so there are now apps available by which all you need to remember is just one password. And then if you know that password, that app will go and fill in the right username and password for whatever other site you're going to. Or sometimes if you have a big home and then there are lots of rooms which will need locking, and if each room had a different key, then you'll have a whole bunch of keys to manage. And so sometimes what we end up doing, have one master key. That one key will open any door in your own house. That's the kind of psychology here. That's the reason the student goes and asks the teacher, there are just too many things to know. Is there one thing knowing by which I can know everything? And then the teacher says, yes. And as you might guess, what the teacher is saying, if you know yourself, if you know who you really are, you will have answer to everything. So that's like the mother of all ignorance. That's the source of all ignorance. So if I can uproot a tree of ignorance by the roots, all the branches and everything will come up by itself. So all the ignorance will vanish if I just go to the root of that. And the root of that is ignorance of my own self. So your question is good, but the answer is we don't have to know everything individually. We just have to know this one thing. And if this one thing doesn't interest us, then we can spend time trying to know as much as possible in this life and feel a little bit frustrated that we cannot know everything. That's another option. That's the thing. Yeah.
Swamiji, when you said that question in Mundaka Upanishad about that one thing knowing which you know everything else, the first thing that came to my mind is Google.
Yeah.
These days, I'm just...
No, it's good. I mean, it's a point well taken, except that Google answers are not always dependable. I mean, Google will give you a range of answers, and then you still have to choose which of them. And usually the answers of those who have paid something to Google will come up on top. So, not usually very helpful, but not totally dependable.
Right.
In fact, some time back, someone had composed a long Sanskrit hymn on Google, and it was called Sri Googleshwaraya Namaha. And then given how many different ways Google has been very helpful. Actually, well composed, the hymn. So people are very innovative. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, my question really was, so if enlightened beings, how come they don't know how the imperfect or the perfect became associated with the imperfect?
Actually, the question how the perfect became imperfect cannot be answered because the question cannot be logically formulated. The question, how did the perfect become imperfect, is actually a nonsense question. Because when you're saying how the perfect became imperfect, if the perfect could become imperfect, it was never perfect to begin with. Because what is the sign of perfection? That's absolute perfection. So if it has become imperfect, it was never perfect. And so the question can't be. So essentially what we are asking is, how a truly perfect thing, which could never have become imperfect, seems to have become imperfect. And the answer is, well, if it seems to have, that means it has not really become imperfect.
But then where was that ignorance? Like, where is it gone? It was there at some point.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Yes, good question. So, does ignorance exist? That's a question. And the answer is, you can't answer that question. You cannot say, okay, before we go to ignorance, let's go to the rope and snake. That is a little bit more tangible. So we mistake a rope for a snake. Okay? And so we are seeing the snake. Now the question is, does the snake exist? You're asking the question, it's a little bit like asking, how did the rope, when we say how the perfect became imperfect, it's equivalent to asking, how did the rope become a snake? Now, how will you answer that question? How did the rope become a snake? And you could say, well, it never became a snake. Well, but I'm seeing the snake. Then you can say, well, you're seeing the snake, but the snake is not really there. It's really a rope. So that's how you say how the perfect became imperfect. Now, it never became imperfect. No, but I'm feeling I'm imperfect. Well, you're not really imperfect. You see?
But Swamiji, in that same example, when I turn on the light, and now I say, oh, it was really the rope, and I was thinking it was snake.
Right.
Now I'm enlightened in that sense.
Right.
And I know how the snake became the rope or the rope became the snake.
No. Then you know that there was never a snake to begin with.
But I can sort of imagine why it was appearing as a snake, right?
No. For imagining, you'll need a mind. Yeah. just what enlightenment really means is that you know you are nothing to do with the body and mind. So why would you imagine anything?
But the body is still there, right, Swamiji? Even after I'm enlightened, the body doesn't go away.
Sure, yeah.
So, or at least that's what we read or hear.
Again, I mean, it's a big thing. Yeah, I think let us leave it at that because this is a big subject. But I'm sure it will come up again when we go further. Yes, Vivek.
Yeah, just maybe one more practical-oriented question. So if we're looking at our devotional exercises, meditation as a way of maybe burning the seeds and eliminating the seeds, okay, that's hard enough in and of itself to maintain continuity, intensity, fervor, but then the bigger problem becomes then we go and we leave the house, we had a nice meditation maybe, but then we're immediately on the battlefield. And then we associate ourselves with those good and bad actions, and we keep filling the tank. What are some practical ways to detach and not become the actor, not become the doer? Because that seems to be the biggest practical difficulty that's just keeps bogging us down again and again.
Yeah, two things. One thing, as I said before, that it's difficult to control the mind because much of our mind is unknown to us. 95% is unknown to our mind. So we ourselves are not aware what's in our own mind. So all efforts to increase our living room, make the basement smaller and smaller, to know what is in my basement, is important. It's only when I am able to go inside my basement, I'm able to throw the junk out. But not everything is junk. There may be some really useful things in my basement. So if I have access to my unconscious part, in other words, which will not be unconscious anymore, I will then know what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, what are the positive impressions in me, what are the negative impressions in me. So that's one thing. And that obviously will need a lot of effort, lot of training, a lot of patience. But the first thing that we can do right now is every time a desire springs in the heart, we know that it has sprung from some impression in my heart. So all that I need to do is ask myself whether fulfillment of that desire will make me stronger or weaker. And just will either physically, mentally, morally, emotionally. And if my answer is yes, doing this, fulfilling desire will make me strong, then I say yes, just say yes to it. So if there is a desire in my heart to say, oh, I must take exercise every day, and then we say, oh, it's a desire. Desires are bad. I'm not going to follow it. It doesn't make sense. It's a good desire. It's going to make me strong. So I have to say yes to it. On the other hand, if some other desire comes in, let's say the doctor has said, avoid sugar, and a desire for rasagulla or desire for some sweet comes in, and then I should say no. So the principle is, every time I say yes to any of these desires which come up, I'm actually increasing, because when I say yes, I'm fulfilling that desire. So I'm creating one more of that species. So if I say yes to a coffee desire, I'm creating an extra coffee impression. Not only that, I'm not only creating an extra coffee impression, I'm making that original coffee impression stronger. Now it feels encouraged. Oh, every time I come up, I get a yes answer. Now, if there are certain desires which come up and I feel that they are going to weaken me, and I use my willpower and say no, no, no. And then, as I said, a desire in itself is not harmful. Unless and until I transform that desire into action. Otherwise, desires are continually coming up. It's like a pot of water which is being kept for boiling. And eventually, bubbles will start coming up and they'll come up and burst on top. Similarly, desires are continuously coming up. Now, if I'm careful, if I know which impressions to say yes and which impressions to say no, so every time I say no, it becomes weaker. It's a little bit like when, let's say in an office environment, if you're someone who's working under you, keeps on asking you, shall I do this? Shall I do this? And every time you say, no, 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 no. And then you say no a lot of times, that person is going to get so demoralized. He said, no point in asking. This person always says no. So this person will not ask you anymore. On the other hand, you say yes, yes, the person says, oh yeah, I'm getting a positive response. So the samskaras are a little bit like that. So what happens is, every time I say no to any of these weakening desires, they are getting weaker and weaker and weaker. They don't come up that frequently. And they are still there. They have not disappeared, but they have become weak. And so that's the first thing we can do right now. Even before we have become yogis, we can use our willpower to decide to which desires we say yes and which desires to say no. So we strengthen the positive, healthy, strong desires in us, and we weaken the unhealthy, weakening desires in us. And then they have a process called these weakened desires. In yoga, sometimes they'll use a very symbolic language, and that is, after these desires are weakened, you dry them, and then burn them. And so that burning, as you referred to before, in the path of devotion, the burning of these desires can come through God's grace. In the path of knowledge, the burning can occur through the just power of knowledge. Light, the fire of knowledge will burn all these things. So there are these different ways that burning gets described. But the first thing is weakening. We cannot burn them unless and until we first weaken them. It's like there's someone very strong, you cannot really go and tackle that person. First is, don't feed that person for 1 month. Then this person is just lying. And then even if you're not very strong, if this person hasn't eaten for a long time, then you can go and slay. So right now our samskaras have become very strong. So immediately going and finishing them won't work. They'll finish us. So first is weaken them. Say. And as I said, there are times when we'll have to say yes, when the good impressions come. So a wise person is one who knows when to say yes and when to say no. If we say yes at the right time, for a right reason, and no for the right time and the right reason, we'll be happy. If we do the opposite, we'll suffer. But suffering is okay, provided we realize our mistake and then don't make the same mistake again. That's how essentially life is, just learning through mistakes and moving on. Nobody is perfect. And already one excuse is, already the perfect has become imperfect anyway. So if we make mistakes, there's nothing to be surprised about. What should be frustrating is that in spite of making mistakes, if we don't learn from our mistakes, if we keep on making the same mistakes over and over again, that means that imperfection has become chronic. Then it's a problem. Otherwise, it's okay. Okay, so we'll stop here now, and then we'll continue this discussion next week. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhuhu. Our subject on Sunday for satsang will be returning home. Next Wednesday we'll continue with the study, and Tuesday and Saturday our meditation will also continue as usual. Let's conclude with a prayer now. Om May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace.